everybody, let's talk about Intro to Literature Week 2. So for this week, I have a couple things outlined for you. You have two things to view. First of all, this video, but also the Prezi on fiction and plot. You will actually only need about half of that Prezi for this week. The other half on character and setting we'll do next week. But just know that they're together. I used to teach it all together in 1 week, but I find that it's better to spread it out. So you have a couple things to read. First of all, you have some pages in the textbook. Remember, we're working in the stories book, in the Norton Siegel books. So those Roman numeral pages are just some background term pages to read over, so it's informational. And then I have a bunch of handouts that I put in there about the novel and short story analysis assignments. So make sure you take a look at those. And then you have 2 stories to read for this week. And I've given you the page numbers where you will find those. So, and then what do you need to complete after you've done all that? The A&P quiz is due by Friday. A Rose for Emily quiz is due on Sunday, and then you need to respond to the discussion board by Friday and to 2 others by Sunday. So again, like I said last week, most things will be due Friday and Sunday. So just keep all of that in mind. Okay, so you can see, like I said, in here you'll have the Prezi that you need, and then I put quite a few things on the literary analysis papers. There's a handout that has some directions about how to make it a paper, what a literary analysis paper should look like. So I put that in there just so you can be thinking about your own short story and your own paper. So you don't have to do anything with those right now. It's really just informational to help you get started. And then I'm putting the literary theories Prezi back in here because you'll need it for your discussion board this week. And then the 2 quizzes are in here, one over A&P and one over A Rose for Emily. And I've also posted the discussion board rubric just so you know how I'm grading your discussion board posts. Okay, so I want to talk about this just a little bit. Oh, I forgot I already had that open. Okay. So we're going to talk about the part that we need to talk about. So this section we're starting on is fiction. Most of the fiction, or the fiction we're going to read, is short story, simply just because we don't have time together to read a novel that is fiction. But it's imagined stories. I used to tell my junior high kids, fiction is fake, right? Nonfiction is not fake. So that's an easy way to remember it. It is the most popular type of writing out there. My students typically love the fiction section of this class. It's probably the one you're most comfortable and familiar with. So it has many genres and subgenres, things like historical, contemporary, realistic, science fiction, fantasy, adventure. All of these are types of fiction. So let me go on here. Some of the other types, things like fables, which we grew up listening to as kids, parables, like the ones Jesus uses when he teaches, legends, like Paul Bunyan and other great, folk heroes, tall tales, mythology. If you love Greek mythology, that would be a type of fiction. Satire, when we use humor to poke fun at the human condition, political issues, things like that. So if you follow something like The Onion or Babylon Bee or something like that, you've seen some satire. Initiation stories, so the main character undergoes some kind of rite of passage. This would be something like To Kill a Mockingbird. Fairy tales, of course. Thank you, Disney. Novels, right? Longer writing, very developed characters, setting, and plot, so we get to know the people and the places and what's happening to them. So novel you will do on your own and then write that paper. But the one we're going to focus on mostly for this class is short story. So just a little bit about short story. It typically only has a few characters. It has a very simple setting. Typically the setting doesn't change. It usually happens all in one place. a very unified idea or effect. So it's trying to get one point across. Okay, we're not following multiple plot threads. You're following one plot thread, usually one or two main characters in one place. It typically has some kind of very vivid or dramatic moment at the end, which is what makes short stories so memorable. Just a little bit of history. They're actually pretty young. Short story is a young type of fiction writing. In 1837, Hawthorne wrote Twice Told Tales, which was a collection of short stories. And so the magazine became really popular. He published all of those, all of these little short stories. And then Poe comes along shortly after Hawthorne and starts writing, what is it that makes a short story, and writes some analysis of American literature. And so Poe defines the short story for us as a narrative that can be read in one sitting. And so he was a literary critic as well as a writer, Poe was, and so he gives us that definition. So short story, still very popular today. Okay, so the basic plot structure that we will follow in these stories is exposition, where we find out who, what, when, okay, who's part of our story, when is it happening, where is it taking place. So all of that happens in the exposition. Then some kind of event causes the rising action, and this is where the conflict happens, that something is working against the character, whether it's man versus self, man versus nature. Something happens in the rising action, all these obstacles that the character has to overcome or experiences that the character has to have. And then we hit the climax. Typically, the climax comes at the very, very end of a story, because otherwise we'd quit reading if it happened in the middle of a story. So usually it comes at the very end. And then this is where the question we've been trying to answer the whole time we've been going through the rising action, whatever it is that character is trying to overcome, it's when we finally answer the question, will he or she overcome it? And we find out typically yes. And it's that moment that character has that watershed moment where we find out the answer of how is this all going to work out in the end. Okay, so even though the rising action can have really exciting parts to it, the climax is where the big question is resolved, where we find out the big answer, or the big answer to the big question we've been asking. Okay, after that, you get some falling action. So what is the fallout from this new understanding? And then what we call the denouement, conclusion, resolution. And that is, and sort of that, and they all lived happily ever after part. Okay, where we find out, how does the character move on? I will say in short story, a lot of times we hit that climax and we may have just a tiny bit of falling action, but it's very, very short. So just know that it doesn't necessarily always look like this kind of line. It may just look more like, exposition, rising action, climax, and then it just stops. Or maybe you have just a little bit of conclusion. So just, know that it doesn't always follow that line exactly. Some other plot terms to know: foreshadowing, where we hint about what's coming next. Flashback, when the character remembers details that happened in the past. In medias res means we start in the middle. So if you start a story in the middle of the action, we call that in medias res. This was very, very popular with the Greeks and Romans. So a lot of Greek mythology starts this way. The Odyssey would be an example of that. So anything that starts in the middle of the story. Okay, and then peripeteia is when we have a sudden change of fortune, and it happens very, very quickly. One little thing happens and suddenly everything is different, good or bad, typically bad. So just a couple of plot terms to know. Also be sure you understand point of view. First person is when the character is the one telling us the story. We have very limited knowledge of anything outside the character's knowledge. Third, dramatic. It sounds like straight dialogue and action, but there's no interpretation. There's no narrative that goes with it. Typically, this is what we have in plays. All right, so we won't see that much in short story. We will see that in drama. Okay. Third, limited, where we see into one character and we follow that one character around. But we still have some narration because we have somebody outside the character telling us and we follow one character. And then omniscient is where we get to follow many, many characters. So, understand those terms. Make sure you're entering these on your fiction term sheet so that you're ready to go. All right, and then we will talk about character and setting next week, so we're not going to worry about that. Okay? All right, going back to week 2. So take a look at the handouts. Any questions you have about the paper thus far? Remember, your first paper is over a short story you choose, but it cannot be one that we read together. It can be from an author we read together, but it cannot be a short story we do together in class. Okay? But other than that, you're welcome to choose anything. I would suggest starting with the textbook because you already own it, and so you already have copies of lots of short stories in the textbook. And honestly, if they make it in the textbook, it's because they're decent stories that I think you'll enjoy. All right. So I hope you enjoy A&P and A Rose for Emily for this week. These are some of my favorite stories. So I think you'll enjoy them too. Don't forget to take your quizzes and then join me in the discussion board, which is right over here. All right. Have a great week.